The rain battered the windshield, each drop a hammer against Benjamin's resolve. He sat motionless in his car, staring at the glowing phone screen in his trembling hand. A single message from an unknown number burned into his vision. Your wife and father-in-law have been lying to you. Check the safe in your study. His heart thundered, drowning out the storm. The safe, the one he'd never touched, because it was hers. With a ragged breath, he stepped into the night, the cold rain soaking him as he faced a house that no longer felt like home. The scent of roasted coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the faint tang of polished wood in Benjamin's study. It was a sanctuary, a corner of the world where he could shut out the chaos of deadlines and corporate politics. The walls were lined with bookshelves, their spines worn from years of late-night reading. A single framed photo sat on the desk. Him and Elise, laughing on a windswept beach, her auburn hair tangled in the breeze. That was 3 years ago, before the silences grew longer, before the warmth in her eyes dimmed. Benjamin leaned back in his chair, his laptop screen casting a pale glow across his face. At 38, he was still lean, though the first threads of gray had begun to weave into his dark hair. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, drafting an email to his team at Verdant Solutions, the sustainability firm he'd built from a fledgling startup into a respected name. Tonight, he was finalizing a proposal for a major client, a contract that could secure the company's future for years. His jaw tightened as he typed, the weight of responsibility pressing against his chest. Ben. Elisa's voice drifted from the doorway, soft but clipped like a note played slightly off-key. She stood there, her arms crossed, wearing a cream sweater that hung loosely on her frame. Her green eyes, once so vibrant, seemed guarded, as if she were holding something back. "Hey," he said, forcing a smile. "Just wrapping up. Big day tomorrow." She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Don't stay up too late. You've been distant lately." The words stung, not because they were untrue, but because they mirrored his own thoughts. He wanted to reach for her, to bridge the growing chasm between them, but something in her posture, rigid, almost offensive, stopped him. "I'll be up soon," he said instead, his voice quieter than he intended. Elise lingered for a moment, then turned and left, her footsteps fading down the hall. Benjamin exhaled, rubbing his temples. He told himself it was just stress, his workload, her late nights at the gallery, the endless dance of keeping their marriage afloat. But deep down, a nagging unease had taken root, like a splinter he couldn't quite reach. He saved his work and closed the laptop, his gaze drifting to the safe tucked beneath the desk. It was a sleek, black box, no bigger than a microwave, with a digital keypad that glowed faintly in the dim light. Elise had insisted on installing it when they moved into the house 2 years ago, saying it was for her late mother's jewelry and important documents. Benjamin had never questioned it. Trust was the foundation of their marriage, or so he thought. The rain began to fall outside, a soft patter against the windows that grew into a steady drumbeat. He stood, stretching his stiff limbs, and crossed to the window. The street below was empty, the sodium streetlights casting pools of orange on the wet pavement. He was about to turn away when his phone buzzed on the desk, a sharp vibration that made him flinch. He picked it up, expecting a late-night email from a colleague. Instead, it was a text from an unknown number. His breath caught as he read the words. "Your wife and father-in-law have been lying to you. Check the safe in your study." The room seemed to tilt. His pulse quickened, a dull roar in his ears. He read the message again, then a third time, as if repetition might unravel its meaning. His father-in-law, Richard, was a towering figure in their lives, a retired investment banker with a handshake like a vice and a knack for making Benjamin feel like an outsider in his own marriage. Richard had always been overly involved, calling Elise daily, dropping by unannounced with bottles of overpriced wine. But lying? About what? Benjamin's eyes flicked to the safe. His mouth went dry. He knelt beside it, the carpet rough against his knees, and stared at the keypad. Elise had never shared the code. "It's just sentimental stuff," she'd said once, her voice light but firm. He'd let it go, not wanting to press her. Now, the safe loomed like a locked door to a truth he wasn't sure he wanted to face. He typed in her birthday, nothing. Their anniversary, nothing. His fingers hesitated, then entered the date of her mother's death, a number she'd mentioned only once, in a rare moment of vulnerability. The safe beeped, and the door clicked open. Inside was a small stack of papers, a velvet jewelry box, and a USB drive. His hands shook as he reached for the papers first. They were legal documents, dense with fine print. His eyes scanned the top page, and his stomach dropped. It was a contract, dated 6 months ago, transferring a 40% stake in Verdant Solutions to a shell company registered in Richard's name. Benjamin's signature was at the bottom, but he'd never signed this. It was forged, the loops of his name too perfect, too deliberate. He set the papers down, his mind racing. The USB drive was next. He plugged it into his laptop, his heart pounding as a single video file appeared. He clicked play, and Elisa's face filled the screen, her voice low and urgent. She was in Richard's office, the mahogany desk and leather chairs unmistakable. "We can't tell Ben," she said, her eyes darting nervously. "He'd never agree to sell. But if we push this through, we'll have enough to start over. Somewhere new." Richard's voice, calm and authoritative, came from off-screen. "He's too idealistic, Elise. Verdant's a sinking ship. This is for his own good." The video ended and silence filled the room, broken only by the rain. Benjamin sat frozen, the betrayal slicing through him like a blade. His wife, his partner, had conspired with her father to dismantle everything he'd built. The company wasn't just his career. It was his legacy, his proof that he could make a difference in a world choking on greed. And they'd taken it from him. He stood, his legs unsteady, and stumbled to the window. The storm raged outside, mirroring the chaos in his chest. He wanted to confront Elise, to demand answers, but the weight of her betrayal anchored him in place. Who was she, really? The woman he'd vowed to love, or the stranger in that video, plotting behind his back? His phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. "You deserve the truth, but be careful. They're watching." Benjamin's grip tightened on the phone. He didn't know who was sending these messages or why, but one thing was clear. The life he'd known was unraveling, and he was standing at the edge of a truth that could destroy him or set him free. The diner smelled of grease and stale coffee, its fluorescent lights casting a sickly glow over the cracked vinyl booths. Benjamin sat in the corner, his hands wrapped around a mug that had long gone cold. The hum of late-night conversations and the clatter of dishes faded into a dull roar in his mind. It had been 3 weeks since he'd walked out of the house, leaving behind the forged documents, the USB drive, and the life he thought he knew. 3 weeks since Elisa's tear-streaked face had pleaded with him to stay, her words a tangle of apologies and excuses he couldn't untangle. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she'd said, her voice breaking as she stood in the doorway, rain-soaked and trembling. "Dad convinced me it was the only way to save us." "Save us?" Benjamin had spat, his voice raw. "You sold my company. You sold me." She'd reach for him, but he'd step back, the distance between them a chasm too wide to cross. He'd packed a bag and left, the storm swallowing his footsteps as he drove into the night. Now, he was a ghost in his own life, drifting through cheap motels and diners, his savings dwindling with each passing day. The diner's jukebox kicked on, a mournful country tune that grated against his nerves. He stared at the mug, its chipped rim reflecting the light like a broken promise. Verdant Solutions was gone, stripped from him in a boardroom coup orchestrated by Richard. The forged contract had been enough to convince the board, and Benjamin's absence in the aftermath had sealed his fate. He'd been too shattered to fight, too betrayed to face the colleagues who'd once called him a visionary. The irony was bitter. He'd built a company to save the world, but he couldn't save himself. His phone sat on the table, its screen dark. No more messages from the unknown number. Whoever had tipped him off had vanished, leaving him to drown in the wreckage of their truth. He'd tried tracing the number, but it was a burner, untraceable. The mystery of it gnawed at him, a loose thread in a tapestry of lies. Refill? The waitress, a woman with tired eyes and a name tag reading Marge, hovered beside him. Her voice was gentle, as if she sensed a storm brewing beneath his silence. Benjamin nodded, forcing a small smile. "Thanks." She poured the coffee, the steam curling upward like a fleeting ghost. "You look like you're carrying the world, Han," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. "Want to talk about it?" He hesitated, the weight of his story pressing against his throat. But something in her weathered face, lines etched by years of listening to strangers' sorrows, loosened the knot in his chest. "Ever feel like everything you built just crumbled?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marge leaned against the booth, her arms crossed. "More times than I can count. Husband left me with 2 kids and a pile of debt. Took years to crawl out of that hole. But you know what? Sometimes the rubble's where you find yourself." Her words landed softly, a flicker of warmth in the cold expanse of his grief. He didn't know if he believed her, but the kindness in her voice was a lifeline, however fragile. "I don't even know who I am anymore," he admitted, his gaze dropping to the table. "You're still here," Marge said simply. "That's a start." She patted his shoulder and moved on to another table, leaving him with the echo of her words. Benjamin sipped the coffee, its bitterness grounding him. He thought of the man he used to be, driven, hopeful, the one who'd wake at dawn to sketch ideas for sustainable energy grids. That man felt like a stranger now, buried beneath the wreckage of Elisa's betrayal and Richard's machinations. Yet, in the quiet of the diner, a small spark flickered. He wasn't ready to give up, not entirely. He pulled a napkin from the dispenser and began to scribble, his hand moving almost on instinct. Names, dates, fragments of conversations with Elise and Richard over the past year. The contract, the video, the shell company. It was a puzzle, and he was starting to see the edges. Richard had always been meticulous, a man who planned 3 moves ahead. If Benjamin was going to unravel this, he needed to think like him. The bell above the diner's door jingled, and a man in a worn leather jacket stepped inside, shaking rain from his hair. He scanned the room, his eyes lingering on Benjamin for a moment too long before he slid into a booth near the door. Benjamin's pulse quickened. The man's presence felt deliberate, like a shadow cast by the unknown number's warnings. "They're watching." He folded the napkin and tucked it into his pocket, his mind racing. Paranoia, maybe, but he couldn't afford to ignore it. He left a few bills on the table and stood, nodding to Marge as he headed for the door. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the air thick with the scent of wet asphalt. He glanced back to the diner's window, and the man in the leather jacket was watching him, his expression unreadable. Benjamin's motel room was a 10-minute walk, a drab box with peeling wallpaper, and a bed that creaked under his weight. He locked the door behind him, his heart still pounding, and pulled out the napkin. He added another note, "Man in diner." Connected? Then he opened his laptop, the only thing he'd taken from the house besides clothes. He hadn't checked his email in days, afraid of what he might find. But now he needed answers. There was a new message, buried among the spam and condolence notes from former colleagues. The sender was anonymous, the subject line blank. He clicked it, his breath catching as he read. "Richard's meeting investors tomorrow, 7 p.m., the Crest Hotel, room 412. You want the truth? Be there. Destroy this email." Benjamin's hands trembled as he deleted the message, his mind a whirlwind of fear and resolve. The Crest was downtown, a sleek tower where Richard's kind thrived, men who traded power like currency. Going there meant stepping into the lion's den, risking everything for a chance at answers. But staying here, hiding in the shadows of his own life, was no life at all. He leaned back against the headboard, the napkin crumpled in his fist. The betrayal still burned, but beneath it, something new was stirring, a quiet, dangerous anger. Richard and Elise had taken his company, his marriage, his trust. They thought they'd broken him. But they'd underestimated one thing. A man with nothing left to lose was a man who could fight. Tomorrow, he'd walk into that hotel. Not as the man he'd been, but as someone new, someone who'd learned the cost of trust and the power of truth. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The Crest Hotel's lobby gleamed with polished marble and soft golden light. A world apart from the gritty motels Benjamin had called home for the past month. He stood near the entrance, his reflection distorted in the glass doors, a man in a borrowed blazer that hung slightly too loose on his frame. His heart thudded against his ribs, but his face was a mask of calm. Tonight, he wasn't just Benjamin, the betrayed husband or the ousted CEO. He was a shadow, slipping into the heart of Richard's empire to reclaim a piece of himself. The anonymous email had been specific. Room 412, 7 p.m. Benjamin had spent the day piecing together a plan, scribbling notes on napkins and pacing his motel room until the carpet wore thin. He'd called in a favor from an old college friend, Marcus, who worked security at the Crest. Marcus hadn't asked questions, just handed over a staff badge and a warning. Don't do anything stupid, Ben. The badge felt heavy in his pocket now, a fragile key to answers he wasn't sure he was ready to face. He crossed the lobby, keeping his head down as he flashed the badge at the elevator attendant. The ride to the fourth floor was silent, the hum of the machinery amplifying the pulse in his ears. When the doors opened, he stepped into a plush hallway, the carpet muffling his footsteps. Room 412 was at the far end, its door slightly ajar, voices spilling out like smoke. Benjamin pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow. Richard's voice was unmistakable, smooth, commanding, the tone of a man who'd never doubted his own power. The investors are on board, he was saying. Verdant's assets will be liquidated by next quarter. We'll funnel the profits through the offshore accounts as planned. Another voice, unfamiliar, chimed in, a woman, her tone sharp. And Benjamin? He's not going to just disappear. Richard chuckled, a sound that made Benjamin's skin crawl. He's broken. No job, no wife, no fight left. He's not a threat. The words stung, but they also ignited something in Benjamin, a quiet, burning defiance. He edged closer, peering through the crack in the door. Richard stood at a conference table, his silver hair catching the light, flanked by two men in suits and the woman, her back to Benjamin. Papers were spread across the table, alongside a laptop displaying charts Benjamin recognized. Verdant's financials, dissected like a carcass. He wanted to barge in, to demand answers, but he forced himself to stay still. This wasn't the time for a confrontation. He needed evidence, something concrete to expose Richard's scheme. He pulled out his phone, setting it to record, and angled it toward the room. The audio was faint, but it would have to do. The meeting dragged on, each word a nail in the coffin of Benjamin's old life. When it finally ended, he slipped back into the elevator, his mind racing. The recording was a start, but it wasn't enough. Richard's network was vast, his influence a web that stretched across the city. To bring him down, Benjamin needed allies and a strategy. The next morning, Benjamin sat in a cramped office at Green Path Consulting, a small environmental firm he'd once mentored during Verdant's early days. The owner, Clara, was a wiry woman in her 50s with a no-nonsense demeanor and a laugh that could fill a room. She'd offered him a job as a consultant, a lifeline he'd almost been too proud to accept. "You look like hell," Clara said, sliding a coffee across her desk. Her office smelled of lavender and old books, a stark contrast to the sterile boardrooms Benjamin was used to. "But I know you're still sharp. We need someone with your vision." Benjamin managed a faint smile, the warmth of the mug grounding him. "I'm not sure how much vision I've got left, Clara. I lost everything." She leaned forward, her eyes piercing. "You lost a company. You lost a marriage. That's not everything. You got fight in you, Ben. I can see it, even if you can't." Her words echoed Margis in the diner, a reminder that he wasn't as alone as he felt. He took the job, not because he believed in himself, but because he needed a reason to get up in the morning. The work was humbler than verdant. Analyzing data for local green initiatives, drafting proposals for community gardens, but it was honest. Each small task, each nod of approval from Clara, chipped away at the despair that had settled in his bones. In the evenings, Benjamin retreated to his motel room, now cluttered with notebooks and printouts. He'd started digging into Richard's past, using public records and late-night internet searches. What he found was a trail of whispers, lawsuits settled out of court, business partners who'd vanished or retired abruptly. Richard's wealth wasn't just from banking. It was built on manipulation, on bending others to his will. And Elise, Benjamin realized with pang, had been shaped by that world long before they'd met. One night, as he sifted through old articles, he found a name that stopped him cold. Margaret Hensley, a former assistant of Richard who'd filed a whistleblower complaint a decade ago. The case had been dropped, and Margaret had disappeared from public view. Benjamin's gut told him she was a key, someone who might know Richard's playbook. He wrote her name on a sticky note and pinned it to the wall, next to the napkin from the diner. His strategy was taking shape, a quiet chess game played in the shadows. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. Another anonymous message. Margaret Hensley. Find her. She knows what Richard did to Elise's mother. Benjamin's breath caught. Elise's mother, Clara, had died when Elise was a teenager, a car accident that Elise rarely spoke of. The message hinted at something darker, a secret that might explain why Elise had turned against him. He leaned back, the motel's flickering lamp casting shadows across the room. The air smelled of damp carpet and cheap air freshener, but to Benjamin, it was the scent of purpose. He was no longer just a victim. He was a man with a plan, piecing together Richard's sins and Elise's choices. Sympathy for his ex-wife flickered in his chest. She'd been molded by her father's world, just as he'd been blindsided by it. But it was overshadowed by a growing resolve. He opened his laptop and typed Margaret Hensley's name into a search engine, his fingers steady. The road ahead was treacherous, lined with risks he couldn't yet see. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a spark of control. Richard thought he'd won, that Benjamin was broken. Let him think that. The truth was a weapon, and Benjamin was learning how to wield it. The game was on, and this time, Benjamin would play to win. The air in Benjamin's new apartment was thick with the scent of fresh paint and cardboard boxes, a modest one-bedroom that felt like a fortress compared to the motel's peeling walls. He sat at a folding table, his laptop open, surrounded by a constellation of sticky notes and printed emails. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, casting sharp shadows across his features. At 38, he looked older now, the lines around his eyes etched deeper by betrayal and resolve. But there was a steadiness in his gaze, a quiet fire that hadn't been there a month ago. For weeks, Benjamin had been building his case, moving pieces across an invisible board. His job at Greenpath Consulting gave him structure, a foothold to stand on while he worked in the shadows. Clara, his boss, had become an unwitting ally, sharing contacts in the environmental sector who'd crossed paths with Richard's ventures. Through them, Benjamin had tracked down Margaret Hensley, now living under a new name in a small town 2 hours away. Her story had been a revelation, a crack in the foundation of Richard's empire. Margaret's voice, hoarse from years of silence, had trembled over the phone. "Richard didn't just ruin me," she'd said. "He destroyed Clara, Elise's mother." The car accident was an accident. She was going to expose his offshore accounts, his bribes. He made sure she never got the chance. Margaret sent Benjamin a scanned copy of a letter Clara had written before her death, detailing Richard's crimes. It wasn't enough to convict, but it was a spark, a thread to pull. Now, Benjamin was weaving those threads into a net. He'd spent late nights combing through financial records, cross-referencing the shell company from the forged contract with Margaret's leads. The offshore accounts were real, hidden behind layers of dummy corporations, but Benjamin had found a pattern. transactions tied to a charity Richard chaired. It was a front, a way to launder Verdon's liquidated assets. The evidence was mounting, but Benjamin needed more than documents. He needed Richard to slip, to expose himself. His phone buzzed, a reminder to tonight's task. He'd arranged a meeting with a journalist, Sarah Klein, who'd been sniffing around Richard's dealing for years. Sarah was sharp, relentless, and hungry for scoop. Benjamin had fed her just enough. Redacted emails, a snippet of the Crest Hotel recording, to hook her without revealing his hand. Tonight, they'd meet at a quiet bar downtown, where he'd hand over Margaret's letter and a USB drive with the financial trails. If Sarah ran the story, it would light a fuse under Richard's carefully curated world. Benjamin stood, smoothing the wrinkles from his button-down shirt. He caught his reflection in the window, the city lights blurring behind him. The man staring back was no longer the broken figure from the diner. He was calculated, deliberate, a strategist playing a long game. But beneath the calm, a storm of emotions churned. Grief at a life he'd lost, anger at Elisa's betrayal, and a flicker of doubt. Was revenge worth becoming someone he didn't recognize? He pushed the thought aside and grabbed his coat. The bar was a 20-minute walk. The air crisp with the bite of early autumn. The streets hummed with life. Couples laughing, cabs honking, but Benjamin moved through it like a ghost, his mind on the chessboard. He didn't notice the black sedan idling across from the bar until he was steps from the entrance. The window rolled down and Elisa's face appeared, her green eyes wide with something between fear and desperation. "Ben," she called, her voice cutting through the noise. "We need to talk." His heart lurched, but he kept his expression neutral, stopping a few feet from the car. "What's there to talk about, Elise? You made your choices." She stepped out, her coat pulled tight against the chill. Up close, she looked fragile, her auburn hair tucked messily under a scarf. "I know you're doing something," she said, her voice low. "Dad's been paranoid, hiring extra security. He thinks someone's digging into his accounts. It's you, isn't it?" Benjamin's pulse quickened, but he forced a shrug. "I'm just trying to move on. Maybe he's jumping at shadows." "Don't lie to me," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "I know you, Ben. You don't just let things go. Whatever you're planning, it's not worth it. He'll crush you." The words hung between them, heavy with history. For a moment, Benjamin saw the woman he'd loved, the one who'd danced with him in their kitchen, who'd whispered dreams of a better world. But that woman was gone, replaced by someone complicit in his ruin. "You crushed me first," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the ache in his chest. "You and your father. Don't pretend you care now." Elise flinched, her lips parting as if to argue, but no words came. She stepped back, her gaze dropping to the pavement. "Just be careful," she whispered, then slid back into the car. The sedan pulled away, leaving Benjamin alone in the neon glow of the bar sign. He exhaled, his breath visible in the cold. Elisa's warning confirmed it. Richard was rattled. The net was tightening, and they could feel it. Benjamin pushed to the bar's door, the murmur of conversation and clink of glasses washing over him. Sarah was at a corner table, her notebook open, her dark hair pulled into a tight bun. She looked up as he approached, her eyes sharp with anticipation. "You got something big, don't you?" she said, skipping pleasantries. Benjamin slid the USB drive across the table, his fingers lingering on its edges. "Enough to start a fire," he said. "Run the story, but keep my name out of it. For now." Sarah nodded, pocketing the drive. "This could bring him down, you know? Men like Richard don't fall easy." "They don't," Benjamin agreed, his voice low, "but they do fall." He left the bar, the weight of the encounter with Elise lingering like a bruise. Her fear had been real, but so was her complicity. Sympathy battled with resolve, but the latter won. He wasn't doing this for her, or even for himself. He was doing it for the truth, for the legacy Richard had stolen, for the man he was still becoming. Back in his apartment, Benjamin added a new note to his wall. Elise knows. Richard's on edge. The pieces were in place. Sarah's story, Margaret's letter, the financial trails. But the final move required precision, a moment where Richard's arrogance would be his undoing. Benjamin opened his laptop and drafted an email to an old Verdon colleague. Someone still loyal. Someone who would get him into Richard's charity gala next week. It was a perfect stage, a room full of Richard's allies and enemies, where a single spark could ignite everything. He leaned back, the cities unfiltering through the window. The gala loomed like a horizon, bright with possibility and danger. Richard thought he'd won, that Benjamin was a ghost. But ghosts could haunt, and Benjamin was ready to become a specter Richard would never forget. The ballroom of the Grand Meridian Hotel shimmered with opulence. Crystal chandeliers casting prisms of light across silk-draped tables. The charity gala was Richard's domain, a stage where he played the benevolent philanthropist, his smile a mask for the predator beneath. Men in tuxedos and women in glittering gowns mingled, their laughter veneer over whispered deals and power plays. Benjamin stood at the edge of the room, a glass of untouched champagne in his hand, his face a study and calm. Inside, his heart was a furnace, fueled by months of planning, betrayal, and a truth that demanded to be heard. He wore a tailored suit, borrowed from Clara, who become more than a boss, a confidant who believed in his fight. His old Verdon colleague, Tom, had slipped him an invitation. No questions asked, his loyalty a quiet rebellion against Richard's coup. Benjamin's plan was a blade, honed to precision. Expose Richard's crimes in front of his allies, unravel his empire, and reclaim his own narrative. The USB drive in his pocket held everything. Margaret's letter, the financial trails, the Crest Hotel recording, and Sarah Klein's article, published this morning, its headline screaming, "Bankers' Charity a Front for Fraud." The article had been the first domino, sending ripples through Richard's world. Benjamin had watched from the sidelines as Richard's phone buzzed relentlessly, his polished facade cracking with each call. Now, as Richard took the stage to deliver his keynote, Benjamin moved through the crowd, his steps deliberate, his expression serene. He was a ghost no longer. He was the architect of this moment. Richard's voice boomed through the speakers, smooth as ever. Tonight, we celebrate giving back, building a future for our community. The crowd applauded, but Benjamin caught the nervous glances, the whispers behind manicured hands. Sarah's article had done its work, planting seeds of doubt. It was time to water them. Benjamin nodded to Tom, stationed near the AV booth. A moment later, the lights dimmed, and the massive screen behind Richard flickered. The crowd murmured as the charity's logo vanished, replaced by the grainy footage from the Crest Hotel. Richard's voice filled the room. Verdon's a sinking ship. This is for his own good. The image shifted to scanned documents, offshore accounts, forged contracts, Clara's letter detailing Richard's role in her death. Gasps rippled to the audience, a tide of shock and outrage. Richard froze, his face paling under the spotlight. "Turn it off!" he barked, but Tom had locked the booth, the presentation running on a loop. Benjamin stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "You thought you could bury me, Richard. You thought you could steal my company, my life, and walk away clean. But the truth doesn't stay buried." The room fell silent, all eyes on Benjamin. He felt the weight of their stares, but he stood tall, his composure unshaken. "You forged my signature, laundered Verdon's assets, and silenced anyone who got in your way, including Elisa's mother." He turned to the crowd, his voice steady but laced with fire. "This man is no philanthropist. He's a thief, a liar, and a murderer." Richard's face twisted, his charm replaced by raw panic. "Lies!" he shouted, but the evidence on the screen was undeniable. Investors stood, phones in hand, already dialing lawyers and regulators. Benjamin's gaze shifted to Elise, who stood near the stage, her face a mask of horror. Her eyes met his, and for a moment he saw the girl he'd loved, trapped in her father's web. But the moment passed, and he turned away. She'd made her choice. Security moved toward Benjamin, but the crowd's uproar slowed them, a sea of chaos he'd unleashed. He slipped the USB drive to Sarah, who'd been waiting in the wings, her camera rolling. "Finish it," he said, and she nodded, already uploading the footage to her outlet's live stream. The world would see this, unfiltered, unstoppable. Richard lunged from the stage, his hands grabbing Benjamin's jacket. "You'll regret this," he hissed, his breath hot with desperation. Benjamin didn't flinch, his voice low and lethal. "You underestimated me, Richard. That was your mistake." He pulled free, leaving Richard to face the crowd's wrath. Elise rushed to her father's side, her voice breaking. "Ben, please, stop this." But Benjamin walked away, the sound of her pleas fading into the din. She'd been complicit, a partner in his ruin, and though his heart ached, he couldn't save her from the consequences. Outside, the night air was sharp, the city's pulse a distant hum. Benjamin leaned against a lamppost, his breath visible in the cold. Sirens wailed in the distance. Regulators, tipped off by Sarah, were already closing in. Richard's empire was crumbling, his allies abandoning him as the evidence spread like wildfire. Elise would face scrutiny, her role in the fraud exposed. They'd lost everything, just as they'd taken everything from him. He pulled the napkin from his pocket, the one he'd scribbled on in the diner months ago. Names, dates, fragment of a life shattered and rebuilt. He tore it into pieces, letting the wind carry them away. The revenge was complete, but it wasn't sweet. It was heavy, a weight he'd carry forever. He'd exposed the truth, reclaimed his name, but the cost was a marriage, a dream, a version of himself he'd never get back. Clara's words echoed in his mind. Sometimes the rubble's where you find yourself. He was no longer the idealistic CEO, or the broken man in the motel. He was something new, scarred, resolute, a survivor who'd learned the price of trust and the power of truth. Green Path was thriving under his guidance, a small but honest legacy. He'd rebuild, not for glory, but for the quiet satisfaction of doing what was right. The sirens grew louder, and Benjamin walked into the night, his steps steady. The city stretched before him, vast and unforgiving, but he wasn't afraid. He'd faced the worst and come out stronger. The frame of his old life was shattered, but in its place, he built something unbreakable, a man who'd never be underestimated again. As the first snowflakes fell, Benjamin tilted his face to the sky, letting the cold kiss his skin. The storm was over, but its echoes would linger, a bittersweet reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd gained. He was free, not from pain, but from the shadows of betrayal. And that, he knew, was enough.